It says we're live. So we are live, and today we have a special guest. We are going abroad, let's say, for the second time. We've had a little break, and we are joined today by Father James Corkery, a Jesuit, a true Jesuit from Rome. We can say even the Jesuit headquarters almost. He's at the Il Gesù, which is sort of the main Jesuit church in Rome and the whole world, we can say. And he's a professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University. So how high can you get, we can say, in the Jesuit and Catholic world? You're a professor in Rome at the Pontifical Jesuit University. So this is very interesting. And you have also visited Finland. Actually, you are my opponent at my doctoral defense. So you were here just over a year ago, and now it's the first time we actually see each other after that. So very wonderful to see you, and welcome on, Father Jim.
Thank you very much, Emil. I'm glad to be back in Finland.
Okay, yeah, great to see you. I'm just going to give a brief introduction in Finnish also for the other listeners perhaps. So niille, jotka ei ehkä englantia niin hyvin pysty seuraamaan, niin meillä on vieraana ihan oikea jesuiitta tänään, eli isä Jim tai James Corkery, joka on irlantilainen jesuiitta ja asuu Roomassa ja opettaa siellä paavillisessa Gregoriana-yliopistossa ja asuu siellä ihan jesuiittojen pääkirkolla. Ja sieltä meidän kanssa tänään juttelee ja puhutaan vähän jesuiitoista ja sitten tietysti päivän lukukappaleista, eli Luukas 19. Isä Jim oli mun opponenttina väitöstilaisuudessani vähän yli vuosi sitten täällä Suomessa ja muistaa sieltä varmaan jotain. What do you remember from your visit to Finland? You were here only a few days, but you actually got to do quite a lot.
Well, I remember many things. I remember the city. I remember it was cold. I left Rome in 22 degrees, and as I stepped off the plane, it was 2 degrees. This was late October, if I remember, or
early November,
when I arrived.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I remember the warmth of the hospitality. I will never allow myself to say anything about Finnish people not being warm and welcoming, even if they're in a cold climate, because I was very warmly received by you and by Beata, by the university, by my colleagues, everywhere I went, pastoral visits. I was...
You celebrated Mass at the Carmelites and at our cathedral, St. Henry's, and and also met some Lutheran pastors and visited the library and a chapel and things like that, some tourism and some academic. You talked about the Jesuits at the university as well, and maybe I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about what it means to be a Jesuit for you. I know Finns only know Jesuits from some stories where they appear as sort of sneaky murderers and so maybe if somebody looks into history, they might know that Saint Ignatius of Loyola started the Jesuits. He was a Spaniard and read the lives of the saints and wanted to become one himself, and he was a soldier, right? And in hospital he was reading these saints' lives, and then he started this Society of Jesus, and then they were sort of engaged in the Counter-Reformation. So that's where the sort of bad reputation comes from in these Lutheran countries, I guess. And then maybe some people might know that you have a lot of universities all over the world, and you sort of are quite good at education. You have a long formation. You have to study a lot to be a Jesuit and things like this. But and maybe some people have even heard about the Ignatian retreats. Even the Lutherans in Finland do those sometimes. These retreats, spiritual retreats, and Ignatian exercises. So is there something more? Can you fill in what's lacking here, or maybe personally what it means mostly for you to be a Jesuit?
Well, everybody who knows you, Emil, in Finland, and I think that's everybody, they know if you make a summary, it'll be a good one. So it's not so much that there's anything to add, but the deepest dimension of being a Jesuit, following the road of St. Ignatius, is that you have experienced God. Ignatius was certain he experienced God. Recovering on his sickbed, reading the lives of the saints, at first slowly. In some ways he wanted to live a holy life himself because he wanted to outdo them. his motives were not all of the highest quality, but slowly but surely walking with God and trying to find his way and searching his experience and reflecting on it, he came to see that God deals with and calls individual people to be part of God's dream for the world. And Ignatius, he didn't found the Jesuits overnight. He made some friends at the University of Paris, and then eventually they came to see that they could do some things together. And slowly, it eventually came to the point that this band of young men thought God was inviting them to stay together. And that turned into eventually seeking the Pope's approval for a small religious community, which initially, in the first approval in 1540, was restricted to 60 members. It eventually grew to 36,000 around the middle of the 1960s, and now it's about half that. But the thing that's at the center of the Jesuits' life is not in a pious way or not in a, kind of miraculous sounding way, but the sense that the human being is created for God. And when the human being finds his or her way in tandem, hand in hand with God in the world, that is the way to shape your life, or let it be shaped.
Yeah. So let me push you a bit more on the sort of popular image of the Jesuit mentality, the saying, the end justifies the means. Is that something that you actually teach or are taught?
No. We have this for being a little bit sneaky and politically astute and politically self-serving. And well, some of history would support, because Jesuits haven't always behaved perfectly, and with great resources, high levels of education, influence on monarchs and people of power. They, of course, evoked jealousies also. And then the cut and thrust of human life means some people like you, some people don't. And also you learn to maneuver. There's a nice word in the Italian language, and the word is furbo. You might remember it from your time in Rome. A person who's a bit furbo is wise in the ways of the world, no fool. You remember Jesus saying we should be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. You can see in Pope Francis that he's not an idiot, that he knows what's going on around him. He knows what's going on in the world. And some people would say, oh, you can see now, having a Jesuit on top there, there's all this kind of maneuvering and intrigue. Or which is it? Realism. We don't live in a world that... so I would say Jesuits are not endowed with phenomenal innocence. They look around and see nothing but good. Oh no, they look around and they see what's there. Yeah. And they try then to respond to that in a way that's evangelical, the gospel and so on. But we are trained to be astute. And just to finish on that, that's interesting. At the beginning, it is true that it was the time of the Counter-Reformation, and Jesuits were papal theologians at the Council of Trent. So we got the reputation then, with the military background of Ignatius, to be the Pope's stormtroopers. But I can tell you also that from the beginning, if you left anything out of the summary when you praised Jesuit education, it would be Jesuit missions.
Right.
Jesuits from the very beginning went abroad, motivated.
Far east. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. St. Francis Xavier, 1542, already to India. Now, the Jesuits who were abroad, dealing with different cultures, meeting people, trying to talk about God in circumstances and language which were different, they were very adaptable. They didn't destroy anything in the cultures of people that wasn't inimical to the gospel. And they quickly made enemies for this. Other religious orders, even members of other religious orders who were on some of these missions, delated them to Rome because it said they were too worldly, too accommodating, too... So to think of the beginning of the Society of Jesus, Council of Trent started in 1545 or 1546, wasn't it? Anyway, middle of the 1540s, and Jesuits were there, so very papal in a way. But in 1542, Francis Xavier went abroad, and it wasn't long before in India and eventually in China and in Paraguay, as we know from the famous movie The Mission, that the Jesuits ran into serious difficulties with the center, with Rome. And that tension was characterized our life. And that's why you see, oh yeah, they're devils full of intrigue, But we are both very papal, very loyal to the Pope and all that. And at the same time, we try to go to the ends of the earth, which means adaptation.
Right. You mentioned the Pope already. Pope Francis is now a Jesuit as Pope for the first time in history. And of course, there's the technical problem of if he's still under the Jesuit Superior General, if he's still on your list as a Jesuit, and how can he be under him if everyone is supposed to be under the Pope? So have you resolved that one? But then also the other question is if you can still add something on how you understand Pope Francis as a Jesuit, because if you look at the media, usually, especially here, probably elsewhere as well, they can only look at him through the lenses of conservative and liberal and, anti-capitalist or whatever. So in addition to these terms, or better sort of instead of them, do you understand him better from sort of Jesuit background?
Yeah, that's a question that it's nicely fed to me, because you remember when we were together in Finland a year ago, and you had done a very good dissertation on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, and I was your opponent. A word
I get to ask you questions.
Hey, now you get to be mine. Yeah. But there we spoke about Ratzinger, of course, all the time, and that was because also I had done studies on him, and I had written some things. It's very interesting that I understand Pope Benedict very well because I've read everything that he wrote, but I understand Pope Francis very well from the inside, because I'm a Jesuit and so is he, and we've had the same kind of training. I would say at the center of everything that Francis does is a kind of sober, realistic, but optimistic discernment of how we should choose the ways of God in the world. That's at the core of his papacy.
Discernment of spirits, that's the great
discernment. What is good,
yeah,
amid what is there. Sometimes people say the Jesuit slogan is that we find God in all things, but we don't identify all things with God. We know that there's evil and we know that there's good. Sifting the wheat, finding the way, God's way, not ours. But I would say that is I'll tell you an interesting story. I was once with a group of young Jesuits in Amsterdam. We were sent there for a week to get to know each other from different Jesuit provinces around Northwest Europe, and then also just to be in the city. And at the end, it seemed to me, we had gone around in different places in the city, visited some works and so on, but it seemed if we had any gift to bring to Amsterdam, also a welcoming city to us, it would be to help people in their search in life to find the path that God is beckoning them towards. If people were walking that instead of, the Germans would call it Irrwege, ways that are not correct, the level of happiness in the world would rise much more, and of harmony too, and fraternity, fratelli tutti. I think that's at the heart of what Francis wants.
Discernment and fraternity. Very good. So let's move on a little bit to the topic of the day. So we are looking at the Gospel of Luke in this little project I'm doing, sort of Christmas calendar in the Corona times, or Corona calendar. And today is the 19th of December, and the 19th chapter of Luke begins with the story of Sakkeus. And the only sort of Jesuit connection I came up with here was a book review I read on the book by the famous Jesuit James Martin, who has a ministry in the States to the LGBTQ people especially, and I just remember reading that he used this story to illustrate that you should sort of that sort of communion sort of precedes even conversion or something like that. So Jesus comes to and has a meal with sinners even before they are converted, and something like this. What about you as a Jesuit and a preacher? If you had to preach on this text, or I'm sure you've meditated on it many times, for me it's sort of a strange story. I think it appears here only in Luke, and sort of there's this guy Sakkeus, and then we move on. And so what's this whole thing about? So how do you approach this story?
Well, maybe I could connect it a little bit with what you have just been asking me.
Sure.
If I said the main priority for everybody really is to find the way that's being indicated by God and to follow that. That is the key to happiness, the key to holiness, the key to humanity. Sakkeus is an interesting person. He's very small. There's commotion. He knows that somebody's coming. He's heard about this guy. He wants to get a look. You know, like we go upstairs in buildings and look out high windows when important people are passing on the street. So Sakkeus is looking for Jesus, but what he doesn't realize is that Jesus is already looking for him. Sakkeus takes a certain initiative, but the initiative is preceded really by Jesus's eye falling on him. That would be a kind of Jesuit way of seeing things, that already one
Dios
is...
nos primerea, as Pope Francis always says, yeah.
Yeah.
God
So
precedes us. Mm-hmm.
Jesus stops under the tree and he tells him to come down, that he's going to be at his house that evening. The text says that Sakkeus responds joyfully. There is a large-hearted response to Jesus in Sakkeus, and even though he's a chief tax agent, he's got plenty of money, he's among the hated, he's no exemplar, he's not completely captured by his possessions. And in the course of a short conversation, when the people around grumble, he's going to your house, you who are a sinner, then he says, I give away half my possessions. That's considerable. Although I read a commentary on this, he has a bundle of possessions, and somebody said, if he gives away half a bundle, he keeps half a bundle, and half a bundle is still plenty. But anyway, the text makes it clear that he doesn't do that in response to Jesus's presence, that he's been doing that. And that if he does discover he has wronged somebody, he'll give fourfold restitution. So Sakkeus is an ambiguous person. He's not a saint, but he's not untouched by the kinds of things that a human heart should be thinking about. And I'd say that's the same set of characteristics that makes him look to see this Jesus, with the mixture of curiosity and welcome. But very quickly, the curiosity turns to something much warmer, to welcome, because he's already welcomed by Jesus into the circle of Jesus. And then the text says at the end, you know, in verse 10, it's the first 10 verses of Luke, it says about salvation happening in Sakkeus' house that day. And salvation is an important word for Luke. The gospel is about salvation. And when Jesus comes to your house, so I would say Sakkeus is, in the end, he's a likable character because he carries within himself much of what we carry within ourselves. And there's another thing, Emil, in the previous chapter of Luke, which you probably discussed a week ago,
yes,
there is an official. You did?
Yeah. It's a chapter a day. Yeah.
Official, you remember, a ruler, and he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life?
Right.
And Jesus then mentions the commandments. And he said, well, I keep all of those. And then Jesus said, there's one thing you lack. And it was to sell your possessions and give to the poor and come follow me. And the text says, the man became sad because he was very rich. So this was not on. So a guy who looked as clean as a whistle from the outside, keeping all the commandments, upright, etc., his heart was entangled on the inside. Whereas Sakkeus, a guy who did not look as clean as a whistle on the outside, had movements going on in his heart that allowed Jesus to reach him and that enabled him to respond to Jesus in a way much more open. Now, if that's a little bit of Jesuit, what was that word you used? A little bit of Jesuit intrigue or seeing twice or whatever, maybe we should look twice and look for where the movement is that would open a person up Zacchaeus is a clear example. We have a chapel here in our house, a Marco Rubnik chapel, but there are several scenes on the wall, and one is of Zacchaeus. Do you know that I'm not a great historian of art? You know much more, I think.
No.
But, there are an incredible number of paintings
Yeah.
about the Zacchaeus story.
I was going to ask you about the sort of reception history or art history. So yeah, go on if you can. This is good to know. I actually I'm not aware of this. So it's good to know. Yeah.
I don't know too much about the history of the painting of Zacchaeus, but my understanding is that it's a story that captured people's imagination. You know, Luke, of the four evangelists, he's the one who can tell stories best.
Okay.
Think of the stories, like the parables, the disciples coming from Emmaus. I mean, story after story after story. He's a real master storyteller. And Zacchaeus, that story is exclusive to Luke. It's not in any of the other Gospels. But I'd hate if it wasn't there. I just think he's a very... Zacchaeus is a character who gives us hope, because Jesus is looking for him and he looks back. And that's enough for our lives to be changed. To know that we're already being looked for, and just to have the courage to look back. It'll cost you a bit, half your possessions.
All right. Well, thank you for this reflection. I'm going to push you a little bit more now in maybe a different direction. So you've been talking about the Jesuit experience of God and all this. I also know that in addition to Ratzinger, you've read a bit of Lutheran. Since I'm here in a very Lutheran country, I wanted to ask you about this book that I just read not long ago. So I don't know if you've ever come across this. It's called Far from Rome, Near to God. Have you ever seen this book?
No, I haven't read it.
It's testimonies of 50 converted Catholic priests. Converted here means they became some sort of Baptists, more or less fundamentalist Protestants in America. The first one is called Bob Bush, once a Jesuit, now a child of God. And then there's another one called Jose Rico, who says New Life for a Jesuit Priest. So this collection is actually sort of, you mentioned, selling everything and these sort of things. Some of these people say that they actually led a sort of quite rich life, in their orders, even though you're theoretically not supposed to own much, but the order sort of gives you a sort of luxurious life, but it was very sort of empty inside and just doing sort of rituals and stuff. And then they discovered the real sort of gospel by grace alone and things like this, and were born again and became true Christians and so on. So have you come across this phenomenon? You've been a Jesuit for quite a while and a priest in Rome for quite a while, of even priests leaving the church and the faith, or becoming Protestant or something else. And what about you? Like when you read all these 50 testimonies, you feel like you get an idea that, oh my goodness, the whole thing of Catholic priest is just a sort of outward show or theater, or empty inside and things like that. So but obviously one thinks that, well, these are only the ones who converted. There are many more who didn't convert and maybe who are happy. So what about your experience? Have you run into these these cases? And you, as someone who read Luther, how do you deal with how do you see this issue?
Well, yes, I am someone who likes Luther, and I probably came. Yes, well, I lived in Germany for a couple of years, and then also reading a lot of Ratzinger, who likes Luther. Not everything, but he certainly likes Luther, because he says Luther didn't work out his ideas at a desk, but that the way Luther talked and thought about God involved a passion. It made a life's difference. It was existential. So Luther was really, and Ratzinger thinks the same about doing theology and about thinking about divine things. I'm attracted to that in Luther too. Experience of the faith, reliance on Christ. I don't save myself. All this is true. And Luther reminded Catholics of many things they had forgotten. That happens today too. Unfortunately, I don't need to draw attention to the failings of priests. and not just in the area of child sexual abuse that has come out in recent years, but in worldliness. Pope Francis talks about spiritual worldliness, in careerism, in self-reward, in taking the position that you may have. Like at the beginning, when you introduced me and you said, he's blah, 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 blah. And you said, well, how can you get, he's a Jesuit, a priest in Rome, etc. I genuinely wouldn't get any satisfaction from that. I think that if people do, you can, I'm a Jesuit, listen to me, I'm important.
Professor.
Yeah, all that, you know what these two things mean. Yeah. I smile in Ireland when I see death notices and a person's degrees are all written after their name.
They don't take those to heaven with them.
I don't think St. Peter would be that interested in whether you're a member of this or that academy. So I think I would have sympathy towards people who make that move, because they're moving from what seems like a non-nourishing, non-experiential, institutional faith to something that grips them and gives them life. Now, what my difficulty would be is, everything I said to you at the beginning would be that the Jesuit is the person above all who believes that he has and that he can experience God. And that's the experience he has to nourish and follow. Well, how different is that from being an evangelical? Not very. So I wonder what sort of thing happened in their lives as Jesuits. And of course, there can be deviations from what is central. But for Ignatius, what was central? Even here, even in this house, on the other side of the house where I'm living, writing the rule for the Jesuits and all that, praying, waiting to be moved by tears, to have it indicated to him, what is the will of God in Christ for these people? That is very heartfelt. I think pretty evangelical too. So if Jesuits stray from that, we become too intellectual. We want to debate, but not engage. These are, in the end, aberrations. They occur in history because at different periods of time, the intellect is greatly revered and a more academic and dry approach. At other times, there's more space for the experiential. But a Jesuit who doesn't have the experience of God and the desire for the experience of God at the heart of his life, well, then I could understand that he would take some of the directions that you mentioned or described in this book. And for such a person, they might find more there than staying in the Jesuits. To me, I have grown up in Ireland. It was always a Catholic environment, much less so now. But I haven't lived in a world where people, certainly people leave the Catholic faith and do nothing, but not many follow the path that you indicated with the book. But that's just a question of my geographical location.
Right. Well, thank you for your answer. And well, before we conclude, hopefully perhaps with an Irish blessing, is there a verse in this chapter, Luke 19, that you would choose if you had to choose like one verse for the day to meditate on for our viewers and listeners? What's your favorite verse in the story of Sakkeus or the whole chapter?
Yes, when you ask the whole chapter, there are other verses too, from the parable about kingship, and then at the end, Jesus' cleansing of the temple. But I probably would stay with the Zacchaeus piece for two reasons. It is personal. And when you say to me, for something that a person could take away to be nourished, personal, I would take two things from Zacchaeus. The last verse of the Zacchaeus story, for the Son of Man, today salvation has happened in this house. That's one. Salvation means the changing, welcoming, loving, empowering presence of Jesus Christ. Today salvation has happened. It is an event, an occurrence. Life has changed. I would take that one. But the other one I would take is a surprising one. It says, Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, when the others accused him of not being a suitable person for Jesus to come. In an earlier translation into English, the translation was, Zacchaeus stood his ground. And I've always liked that. Instead of backing off or being afraid to welcome Jesus or letting them dominate him with their criticisms, Zacchaeus says, well, look, I'm doing this, I'm trying, I'm moving forward, but he stood his ground. In other words, he didn't let the call of Christ be taken away from him. And that would be a thing I would say to people. We live in a world where there are endless opportunities for the call of Christ to be taken away from us. My goodness, the seductions are everywhere. So know that salvation is coming to your house today. It's happening in your house. That's one text. And the other one is, be like Zacchaeus. Stand your ground. He'll back you up. Does that make sense? It puts in the picture also primarily the initiative of God. We don't save ourselves. I'm a good Lutheran in that. But at the same time, probably this is a slightly Catholic influence. The Council of Trent says we do not do altogether nothing. We at least let ourselves be invited. Okay.
Thank you very much. So if I may ask, since you are a priest and a Jesuit, and we don't get Jesuit blessings too often here in Finland, if you could conclude with a prayer or blessing, English or Irish or both, for us and all the listeners.
I'll conclude with a short prayer in English, and I'll give the blessing that we give in Irish. May the blessing of Almighty God at certain come upon you. My prayer would be, from my warm memories of Finland, I pray, Lord, for the people of Finland, for their health and well-being, for their faith and courage, for their life together as one community under you. I pray for their development and growth and their service. I pray that they will keep faithful to you. I pray that you will always be, as well as being incarnate in many places, I pray this Christmas that you will be Finnish, that you will come to Finland and to be born again in the hearts of all people. And I pray a blessing in Irish, asking Father, Son, and Spirit on all of you. Gomani dia ilo cuchtach shiv goleir, an tahar agus an vik agus an spirit nev.